For as long as I can remember, I have been in love with stories. Legends, folklore, and tales of magic and mystery always brought me a sense of wonder and soon became my favorites. Those types of stories always made the world more magical, and life just seemed more fun that way. Welcome to Art and Lore.
Mary Beth Andrews gripped the steering wheel of her old Chevy, her knuckles turning white as she squinted through the windshield. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing Point Pleasant in an eerie quiet. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 4:55 p.m. She was running late again, and her husband would be worried, and as much as she wanted to speed home, the roads were treacherous, and she could only drive so fast. As she approached the Silver Bridge, Mary Beth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She shivered, recalling the strange sight she had witnessed a week earlier. She'd been driving home late, much like today, when she saw it. A dark figure, larger than any man, with glowing red eyes and wings that stretched wide. It had stood on the side of the road, watching her. She told herself it was just her imagination, maybe a trick of the light. But others had seen it too, and the stories were spreading. Lost in thought, Mary Beth barely noticed the taillights ahead of her until they suddenly stopped. She hit the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just a few inches from the vehicle in front. Heart pounding, she took a deep breath and peered ahead. Traffic was at a standstill on the bridge. She could see the other side, but it still felt so far away. A loud groan, like the sound of metal under immense strain, cut through the air. Mary Beth's breath hitched as the bridge began to sway. Panic erupted around her as people abandoned their cars, running and shouting. She heard a man scream, "It's coming down!" She fumbled with her seatbelt, fingers trembling. The groaning grew louder, almost deafening, until, with a sound like a thunderclap, the Silver Bridge gave way. Mary Beth watched in horror as the road beneath her car crumbled. She barely had time to scream before everything went black. When she awoke, she was in a hospital bed, surrounded by the murmurs of doctors and the beeping of machines. She learned that she was one of the lucky ones, pulled from the wreckage by rescuers. Many others were not so fortunate. The bridge collapse had claimed 46 lives that day. In the days that followed, as she recovered, Mary Beth couldn't shake the image of the Mothman from her mind, and she wasn't the only one. Others who had seen the creature believed it was connected to the tragedy, a harbinger of doom, they said. Whether it was a creature, a spirit, or a figment of collective fear, no one knew for sure. But for Mary Beth, the memory of those glowing red eyes would haunt her forever. This haunting legend, rooted in the small town of Point Pleasant, has captivated imaginations for decades. This is the story of the Mothman. A Prelude to Darkness. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, was the kind of town where the past lingered like the musty scent of old books in the local library. Its streets were paved with history, and each cobblestone had a story to tell. To the casual visitor, Point Pleasant might have seemed like any other small town, but those who lived there knew better. They knew that under the surface, something sinister awaited. It was the fall of 1966, and the town was wrapped in a blanket of perpetual twilight. The days were growing shorter, the nights colder. The trees along the Ohio River stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches stripped bare by the autumn winds. The river itself, dark and brooding, whispered tales of forgotten tragedies that nobody dared repeat. The town had always had its share of peculiar occurrences. Old-timers spoke in hushed tones about the Battle of Point Pleasant and the supposed curse of Chief Cornstalk. The story went that Chief Cornstalk, a formidable leader of the Shawnee people, had placed a curse on the land with his dying breath after being betrayed and murdered by settlers in 1777. Cursed be the ground and the people on it, he had said. Or so the legend went. And for nearly 2 centuries, the town seemed to live under that shadow, with misfortunes and mysterious happenings occurring with unsettling regularity. The locals had grown accustomed to the strange occurrences. They were used to the eerie fog that rolled off the river at dusk. They didn't flinch at the unexplained lights that sometimes danced over the water, nor did they pay much heed to the whispers of ghostly apparitions wandering the old battlegrounds. It was just Point Pleasant being Point Pleasant. But that autumn, something changed. It started as a whisper, a feeling that tickled the edges of the mind, the sense that something was watching. People began to report sightings of a strange creature, tall, with wings like a bat, and eyes that glowed a hellish red. It wasn't long before the sightings became more frequent, and the descriptions more detailed. Whatever it wasn't just the fevered dream of one town drunk. A new darkness was descending onto Point Pleasant, and with it would come real tragedy, undeniable reports, and a shroud of death and mystery that would never lift. The Gravediggers, November 12, 1966. It was a chilly November evening, and the small town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, was settling into its nightly routine. In the local cemetery, a group of gravediggers was hard at work, preparing a final resting place for a soul soon to be laid to rest. As they dug, the men noticed a strange, low-hanging fog creeping in from the nearby Ohio River. It was an eerie sight, but they paid it little mind, accustomed to the oddities that sometimes visited their town. However, their nonchalance was soon shattered by a sound that sent chills down their spines. A soft, rustling noise, like the beating of immense wings. The gravediggers looked up, their shovels poised midair, and what they saw froze them in their tracks. Emerging from the thick fog was a figure unlike anything they had ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally so, with wings that stretched out like those of a massive bird. But it was the eyes that held them transfixed, large, glowing orbs that pierced the darkness with a strange intensity. As the creature drew closer, the men could see its features more clearly. It had a humanoid shape, but its skin was a sickly gray, and its wings seemed to shimmer in the dim light. It moved with a strange, almost hypnotic grace, its eyes never leaving the terrified gravediggers. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The men were paralyzed with fear, unsure of what they were witnessing. But as the creature began to glide closer, one of the gravediggers found his voice. What are you?" he stammered, his words barely more than a whisper. The creature did not answer. Instead, it hovered silently above the ground, its wings beating slowly and rhythmically. It seemed to be studying the men, as if deciding whether they were a threat or not. Sensing danger, the gravediggers dropped their shovels and began to back away, their eyes never leaving the creature. It made no move to follow them, but its presence hung heavy in the air. As they fled the cemetery, the gravediggers could hear the sound of the creature's wings fading into the distance. They ran all the way back to town, where they recounted their harrowing encounter to anybody who would listen. The story spread like wildfire, fueling rumors and speculation throughout Point Pleasant. Some dismissed it as a hoax or a trick of the light, but others believed it to be a sign of something more sinister, a portent of doom. that had come to rest upon their town. And so, the legend of the Mothman was born. The Scarberry Mallette Encounter, November 15th, 1966. Just 3 days after the Gravediggers had their encounter, the town of Point Pleasant was about to encounter the same creature again, this time in what would ultimately be known as the Scarberry Mallette Incident. Roger Scarberry and his wife Linda, along with their friends Steve and Mary Mallette, were out for a leisurely drive near the TNT area, a sprawling expanse of abandoned buildings and overgrown forests that had once been a bustling World War II munitions plant. Little did they know, their evening would take a terrifying turn that would change their lives forever. As they drove along the deserted roads, the group suddenly spotted something out of the corner of their eye. At first, they thought it was just a large bird, perhaps an owl or an eagle. But as they drew closer, they realized this was no ordinary creature. Hovering near the old buildings was a figure unlike anything they had ever seen. It was tall and humanoid, with wings that stretched out like a bat's. But what truly terrified them were its eyes, large glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through the darkness. As the car approached, the creature took off into the air, its wings flapping with a sound like thunder. It circled above them, its eyes fixed on the terrified group below. Then, without warning, it dove toward the car, flying just above the roof with a speed and agility that defied belief. Roger slammed on the gas, desperate to escape the creature's clutches. But no matter how fast he drove, the creature stayed right behind them, its red eyes glowing in the darkness like two burning coals. For what felt like an eternity, the group raced through the night, the creature hot on their heels. They finally reached the safety of town, where they immediately reported their encounter to the authorities. Just like the tale the Gravediggers told, news of the Scarberry Mallette incident spread like wildfire, captivating the public and sparking a new wave of Mothman sightings across the region. The once quiet town of Point Pleasant was now at the center of a media frenzy, with reporters and curious onlookers flocking to the area to catch a glimpse of the mysterious humanoid creature. For Roger, Linda, Steve, and Mary, the encounter would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They became reluctant celebrities, their names forever linked to the legend of the Mothman. But amidst the fame and speculation, one thing remained clear. On that fateful night in November, they had come face to face with something truly out of this world, something that defied all logic and reason. And as they looked back on that night, they knew one thing for certain. The Mothman was real, and it was out there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike again. Fear and panic. After the Scarberry Mallette incident thrust the Mothman into the spotlight, fear and panic began to grip the region like a vice. The once quiet town was now a hotbed of speculation and unease, with residents and visitors alike on edge, wondering what other horrors lurked in the shadows. Reports of Mothman sightings flooded in from all corners, each one more chilling than the last. People claimed to have seen the creature lurking in the woods, perched atop buildings, and even flying alongside their cars. Some described it as a harbinger of doom, a creature sent to warn of impending disaster. Others believed it to be a malevolent entity, intent on causing harm. As the sightings continued, so did the sense of foreboding. The town was on high alert, with residents taking extra precautions and avoiding the TNT area, where many of the sightings had occurred. Rumors swirled, feeding the growing hysteria. Some claimed the Mothman was responsible for a string of local tragedies, from missing pets to unexplained accidents. The local authorities were inundated with reports, but there was little that they could do. The Mothman, if it existed, seemed to be elusive, appearing and disappearing at will. Despite efforts to track and capture the creature, it always remained just out of reach. There was a lot they didn't know about the Mothman, but for an ever-growing number and an ever louder crowd, there was one thing they knew for sure. The Mothman was here to warn about something terrible. And perhaps they were right, because on December 15th, 1967, tragedy struck. The collapse of the Silver Bridge, December 15th, 1967. The Silver Bridge stood as a proud and vital link between Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio, spanning the mighty Ohio River with its steel girders and concrete pillars. For years, it had served as a lifeline for the communities on either side, carrying commuters, travelers, and goods back and forth with reliable steadfastness. But on the fateful evening of December 15th, 1967, that steadfastness would be shattered in an instant, plunging the region into tragedy and forever altering the course of history. It was a cold and blustery evening, with the river below churning ominously beneath the bridge's span. Rush hour traffic was at its peak as cars, trucks, and buses made their way across the bridge, their headlights casting long shadows on the water. Among the vehicles was a school bus filled with children returning home from a day at school. As the bus reached the midpoint of the bridge, a loud metallic groan echoed through the air, followed by a deafening crack. Before anybody could react, the bridge began to buckle and sway, its steel cables snapping like twigs. In a matter of seconds, a section of the bridge collapsed into the river below, taking with it dozens of vehicles and their occupants. The scene was one of chaos and horror as screams filled the air and the river below churned with debris. Rescuers rushed to the scene, but their efforts were hampered by the icy waters and the darkness of the night. In the end, 46 people lost their lives in the disaster, including 2 who were never recovered from the river's depths. In the days and weeks that followed, an investigation was launched to determine the cause of the bridge's collapse. It was eventually determined that a single eye-bar, a crucial component of the bridge's suspension system, had failed due to a small defect that had gone unnoticed for years. The tragedy was a stark reminder of the fragility of infrastructure and the need for constant vigilance in maintenance and inspection. The tragedy also inspired a series of laws, which are now in order to help make sure that this doesn't happen again. The collapse of the Silver Bridge was a tragic event that sent shockwaves through the region, but for the residents of Point Pleasant, it was more than just a structural failure. It was the culmination of a series of strange and unsettling events that had plagued the town for over a year. Since the very first sighting of the Mothman, fear and uncertainty had gripped the community. Reports of the creature had spread, many believing it to be an omen of something devastating to come. Some even speculated that the Mothman was somehow connected to the tragic events that had befallen the town, all the way up to the Silver Bridge. To many, the collapse of the bridge seemed to confirm their worst fears, that it was a direct result of the Mothman's presence, a supernatural force unleashed upon the town. Others dismissed these notions as superstition, attributing the collapse to structural flaws and negligence. Regardless of the cause, the collapse of the bridge marked the end of an era for Point Pleasant. The town had been forever changed by the Mothman sightings and the tragedy that followed, leaving a scar that would never fully heal. Today, the Mothman legends endure as a reminder of those dark days, a cautionary tale of the power of fear and a story of the fragility of life. But it's also a story of community, of a group of people who have overcome that tragedy, even though they've never forgotten it, and who somehow, amidst it all, have found something new to cling to, the legend itself, which is now inextricably linked to Point Pleasant. The aftermath. Today, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, is a town caught between two worlds, a place where tourism and sadness mingle in the shadows of the past. The town's connection to the Mothman legend has made it a destination for those seeking a glimpse of the mysterious and the macabre, but beneath the surface, a sense of melancholy lingers. It's a constant reminder of the tragedies that have befallen the community. For many visitors, Point Pleasant is synonymous with the Mothman, a creature of myth and legend that has captured the imagination ever since it first became a story. The town embraces this legacy, with statues, museums, and even an annual festival, a couple actually, dedicated to the Mothman and its allure. It's also been great for the local economy. Tourists flock to the area, eager to learn more about the creature and the events that made Point Pleasant so famous. But beneath it all, amid the hustle and bustle, the town's residents carry a heavy burden of grief. The collapse of the Silver Bridge remains a painful memory, an open wound, a reminder of the lives lost and of the families shattered by the tragedy. For them, the Mothman is more than just a legend. It's a part of their history, a symbol of the darkness that once engulfed their town. Despite this, the people of Point Pleasant have embraced their town's fame, using it as a way to honor the past and ensure that the memories of those lost are never forgotten. They welcome visitors with open arms, eager to share their stories and to keep the legend of the Mothman and those they love so much alive.
I'd like to give another massive thank you to Raven Reeds for narrating for us again today. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Art and Lore, and if you are just a little confused as to what Art and Lore is, it is a passion project between Raven and I, to where we each pick a topic of folklore and we illustrate and narrate to go along with it, so it's kind of more of a story art experience. So be sure to head on over to her channel to check out the Art and Lore episode of The Kelpie. Links will be in the video description and on your end screen, along with both of our playlists if you want to watch some more Art and Lore. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.